Okay guys, it's day 2. I don't normally take 2 days to build a quadcopter, but I ran into a little bit of trouble. I actually very easily stripped out a couple of the screws on the bottom of this. And before you go calling up X-Hover and saying, what are you doing? I reached out to X-Hover and I was like, hey, what's going on here? And he was like, oh yeah, we got a bad batch of screws. We replaced them all. So, reviewer's curse. I got the bad prototypes. Customers will get good, solid, real non-strip out screws. But it does give me the opportunity to introduce you guys to this little guy. This is a thing called a fluted screw extractor, also known as an easy out. And it's a special kind of drill bit. You put it in your drill and you have the drill turn left-handed, and it basically drills into the head of the screw, and then it grabs it and it backs the screw out. And there's all these tricks for getting a stripped screw head out. Like my favorite one is to take like a Dremel tool or a hacksaw and cut a notch in it, and they sometimes work and they sometimes don't, but these little guys work almost every time. It's about 10 or 11 bucks to get a set of them for every size screw, from big honking ones to little teeny ones, and well worth having in your kit. So you can see that what I've done here is I have replaced, because reviewers curse, the lovely 10-9 alloy steel that the customers are going to get. Well, I don't want to wait for X-Hover to ship me some of those from California, so I just put in some of my own. And you can see I have elected to go with cap head screws. I think that cap head are more durable. Good quality 10-9 or 12-9 steel button head screws will be pretty durable, but I'll take cap head any day, and since I was replacing them anyway, that's what I've done. And here is the resulting stack that I'm going to end up with. This is the ESC in place, and you can see that I've had to do a little bit of work. It could be lower, but because of the length of screws that I've got, I had 8mm and 6mm screws, and what this really needs is 7mm screws. So the screws are sticking up just an extra millimeter, and that means I had to raise the ESC just another 0.5 millimeter. You can see I've got 2 nuts installed here to give this just enough space. This is why you got to just have an assortment. You got to have an assortment of screws, an assortment of standoffs, and you just fiddle with things until you find the right ones to make everything work just right for your build. Got standoffs here, and I am using the female-to-female standoffs because, unlike what I said earlier in the video, I said this guy doesn't have gummies. It does have vibration isolating gummies. So when the flight controller mounts that way, what I like to do is use a female-to-female standoff, set the flight controller on top, and run a screw down through the top, as opposed to having one of the male-to-female standoffs where it comes up through the flight controller and you got to squeeze a nut on there. I find that usually crushes the gummies, and they don't do as good with the vibration isolation. So now let's solder up the motors, and I'm going to take you through the whole step because, you know, I try not to assume that everybody out there is experienced. I've done this 100 times, but maybe this is your first time, so I'll take you through the steps of tinning the motor pads and soldering up the motor wires. And one thing you're going to notice is that I'm not worrying about which motor wire goes where. It is a characteristic of the brushless motors that we use that there's no like positive and negative wire or anything like that. You put the wires on the ESC, and the specific way the wires are connected to the 3 motor pads, you got 3 wires and 3 pads, determines which direction the motor will spin. If you have 3 wires going to the ESC, the motor will spin one direction. If you swap any 2 of those wires with each other, the motor will spin the other direction. And some people say if you wire them straight through, then it's clockwise, and if you wire them crossed over, then it's counterclockwise, and that doesn't actually, it depends on how the ESC is designed and how the motor is wired up. So what I just do is I just wire them up any old way, and then later in software we're going to just switch the direction the motor spins using the BL Heli software. So I'm just going to tin these pads, and I need to make sure, you see that's not as hot as it could be. I didn't get a lot of, it didn't spread out, it didn't really connect well with the pad. What we really want to see is a nice spread out. So let's turn this, we're going to turn the iron up to 850 and see if we can really get the pad nice and hot and get a nice blob of solder on there. And I'm just going to tin each and every one of these motor pads. I'll come over, I'll do the other side next. Then we're going to take the wire, I'm going to hold the wire in position, and I like to give myself just a little bit of slack just to make sure that, just because I always end up cutting it too short and then it's a mess. So I'm just going to cut it to length and strip and tin it. Some people like to run their wires through the inside like this. I think that makes rework hard. Repairs are more difficult. It does keep the wiring neat, but some people say that it makes the wires heat up more. I don't really think that's a factor, but I'm just going to bring them up here from the outside. And because I'm cutting each one to length, I prefer to solder each one as I go, as opposed to cutting and stripping all of them and then soldering them all separately, even though that would be more efficient. I put these standoffs on here just to check the height of the flight controller to make sure that it was going to fit underneath the deck, but I'm going to take that off so I don't accidentally melt it with my soldering iron. Boom. Perfect. Beautiful. It's got a little more slack than you might necessarily want, but it'll be all right. All right, I'm going to go ahead and solder all the rest of the motor wires, and then I'll catch up with you after that. Well, there we go. All the motors are soldered up to the ESC, and the motor wires neatly dressed to keep them out of the way of the props. I do feel a little bit bad that my signature red electrical tape is covering up this beautiful forged carbon. I mean, you want to see the forged carbon, right? So I don't know. You'll probably do that differently and it'll look a lot nicer, but that's how I do it. The next thing to do is attach the XT60 connector. And the first thing I want to do is just check, like, where am I going to route that wire and am I going to have clearance? So I'm just going to grab a propeller. I'm going to stick the propeller on here and I'm going to check the clearance to, like, the standoffs. And what I think I'm going to do is connect this sideways like so and just like kind of route it around to the standoff, like kind of like that. And the reason I'm routing it to the standoff is that I always want to have like a zip tie holding the XT60 connector somewhere on the frame, so that if the battery strap breaks and the battery ejects in a crash, when that battery goes flying off, it doesn't tug on these pads and damage the ESC. So I think that routing is going to work. Yeah, plenty of clearance from the prop, no problem there. This frame actually has a fair amount of clearance. I wonder if it can take 5.5-inch props. It'd be very interesting to know, but let's go ahead and solder this up. I've got my soldering iron at 850 degrees. It's ripping hot, and if I were using a bigger tip, this is a little maybe 2.5mm chisel tip. If I were using a bigger tip, I wouldn't need to have it so freaking hot, 850 degrees Fahrenheit. These are fairly big pads, and you do need to get a fair amount of heat into them, especially, you see how the solder's not sticking to the negative connector, the negative pad? There we go. It takes quite a bit of heat to get that ground pad to take the solder and heat up. The right way to do that, if you're soldering on a nuclear reactor or a spacecraft, is to have a properly sized tip. But if you're me and you hate changing out your soldering iron tips, you just crank that sucker up and let it rip. I've already cut these to the correct length and stripped them. I did that in a previous take where I forgot to hit record, so you don't get to see that. And what I like to do is I have the solder in one hand, the wire in the other hand, and I just set the soldering iron down on the table. And really, I should get my fume extractor here, because this will make a fair amount of smoke. So pardon the noise. Now this solder I'm using is really thinner than it ought to be. I'm doing all kinds of things that I shouldn't do, and I'm not setting a good example for you, because most of the time I have no problem with my solder joints. So I take all these stupid shortcuts and excuses and basically just do it wrong. And I've been doing it long enough, I know what I can get away with. See how long it's taking the wire to heat up enough to take the solder? If I were using a properly sized soldering iron, tip, that wouldn't be happening. Whatever, you get what you get. This isn't a, I was about to say this isn't a how to solder, but I mean, it kind of is. It's how to solder like a schlock. Alright, so I've cut these like so to the length so that they just kind of line up like that. I'm going to start with a negative and then the positive. Definitely double check negative, positive. Double check that you don't screw this up and get this backwards because smoke will come out. I'm going to hold that in place and I'm just going to hold it there and hit it with the iron until it flows. I'm going to see the wire become liquid. I'm just going to keep holding it in place until I want to see the pad also become liquid. It's going to take a minute because this ground pad is pretty substantial. I couldn't actually see what was happening there because I'm trying to keep my head out of the way of the shot. Hold on. So this is not good. So let me show you why it's not good. Can you see that you can see individual strands of wire there? What you want is for the whole joint to become very liquid and for the liquid solder to kind of become a smooth a smooth surface. So if you can see individual strands of wire here, that means that this did not go right. Let's take a look and see how I can fix it. Now there's a solder joint that I feel a little better about. It's pretty smooth and liquid and silver. Yeah, okay, I feel okay about that. And then this guy's going to kind of come in from the side like that. Yeah, no problem. There's not near enough solder on there, I think. I want to get a lot more solder, so I'm going to just lightly apply more solder without applying enough heat to completely flow the joint, and then apply more heat. There we go. And I applied a little heat from this side to get the solder to the solder will always flow toward the heat. So I applied a little heat from this side because this side was looking a little dry and I wasn't getting good contact with the pad over here. I was getting good contact on this side because the iron was coming in from this side. So it was pulling the solder this direction. So I came in just a little bit from this side to pull the solder the other way and kind of even it out over the pad. I feel okay about that. And that will just go like that up against this standoff. And that's where our battery lead's going to go. So at this point, we should be able to plug in a battery and see and hear the motors beep. So let's try that. And as always, the first time we plug in, we are going to use our smoke stopper. Just make sure, just help protect us if we've made any mistakes. But one thing a smoke stopper will not protect against is if you have got the polarity wrong. So let's just double check negative, positive, red, black. And then we're going to check the XT60. Oh, surely you think that XT60 came from T-Motor. Surely it's correct. Yeah, probably. You gonna bet your whole ESC on it? So we got plus, plus, red, black, minus. Okay, now we're good. Let's plug her in. And if you want to, you can hold each individual motor, pinch it in your fingers, and feel it vibrate. So that'll verify for you that each individual motor is getting driven by the ESC. We are in good shape. Next, the flight controller.